Texas, May 19th, 1836. Fort Parker. Dawn has not fully broken yet. The light is thin, uncertain, and the settlement is quiet in the way frontier mornings always were. Too quiet. As it turns out, a 17-year-old girl watches her father-in-law struck down by a war club. She sees the blowland, hears the sound it makes, and understands instantly that there will be no rescue, no negotiation, no second chance. Her mother-in-law is stabbed and left bleeding in the dirt. Before the girl can scream, warriors seize her, lift her bodily, and throw her onto a horse. She is 6 months pregnant. Her name is Rachel Plummer, and for the next 21 months, she will endure experiences so severe that even years later, back in the safety of her father's home, she still refuses to describe them fully. In her published memoir, she writes only this: "To undertake to narrate their treatment would only add to my present distress, for it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less speak or write of it. That silence is not modesty, it is damage. It is the sound of someone who has survived something that language cannot safely carry." Rachel Plummer was not an exception. She was one of thousands. During the 19th century, native tribes across the American Southwest captured hundreds of women from frontier settlements. Some were ransomed back after months or years of negotiation. Some escaped during moments of chaos and walked hundreds of miles back towards settlements they barely remembered. Most were never seen again, and those who did return carried stories that haunted them until their final breath. Stories they could barely bring themselves to tell. Stories that even newspapers, which routinely printed every gruesome detail of public hangings, sometimes refused to publish in full. This is not frontier legend. These are documented accounts, court testimonies given under oath, memoirs written by survivors, military records, letters, and diaries. These stories were read by thousands of 19th century Americans who wanted to know what really happened beyond the edge of the map. And yet, over time, they were softened, simplified, or quietly set aside because they disrupted a more comfortable story. So, let's begin where it always began. The raids followed a pattern. They almost always came at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor and families were most vulnerable. Isolated homesteads were preferred, families living miles from their nearest neighbor, with no one to hear their screams and no time to organize resistance. Speed mattered, surprise mattered, efficiency mattered. The men of the household died first. Husbands, fathers, brothers. Sons old enough to hold a rifle were usually killed within the first few minutes. There was no warning, no negotiation, no mercy. The violence was not chaotic, it was deliberate. Removing armed resistance immediately reduced risk during the long retreat back to tribal territory. Then came the selection. Women of childbearing age were the most valuable. They could work, they could be traded to other tribes or sold to Mexican traders operating slave markets in the northern territories. They could become wives and bear children who would grow up as full members of the tribe. Because given enough time, they could be fully assimilated. They would learn the language, follow the customs, and forget their former lives entirely. The elderly were killed immediately. They could not work. They could not bear children. They would slow the raiding party during the journey back to camp. Infants were often killed as well. A crying baby could alert pursuers. In the brutal arithmetic of survival, they were liabilities the warriors could not afford. This process was ruthless, practical, and stripped of sentiment. Understanding that is uncomfortable, but necessary because it tells us something important. What followed was not random cruelty. It was a system. In February of 1851, 14-year-old Olive Oatman learned that system firsthand. Her family had been traveling west near the Gila River in Arizona with a group of settlers. Disagreements about the route left them isolated and alone, convinced they were only days from safety. The Oatmans pressed on by themselves. They were wrong. Warriors attacked without warning. Olive watched her father beaten to death with clubs. Her mother was killed beside him. Her older sister, her baby brother, 4 of her siblings were murdered in minutes while she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. When the killing stopped, only Olive and her 7-year-old sister, Mary Ann, were left alive. They were dragged into the desert. Olive later described walking barefoot through the wilderness for an entire night, over sharp rocks that sliced her feet open, through patches of cactus that left dozens of spines embedded in her skin. There was no food, no water, no rest. Every time she stumbled from exhaustion, She was struck with clubs. Every time she slowed, she was beaten until she moved faster. Her little sister walked beside her, bleeding from her own wounds, too terrified to cry, too exhausted to speak. By dawn, Olive's feet were so torn and swollen that every step felt like walking on broken glass. But she kept moving, because stopping meant dying. And this was only the first night. Once captives reached the tribal camp, their previous lives ended completely. They were not guests awaiting ransom. They were not prisoners of war. They were not even enemies anymore. They were property. Work began immediately, before wounds healed, before a full meal, before real sleep. Women were sent to gather firewood until their hands cracked and bled, to carry heavy clay vessels of water for miles under the desert sun, to scrape animal hides until their fingers were raw, to dig for edible roots in hard, packed soil. Every task that no one else wanted fell to them. Every job too exhausting or too degrading became theirs. They ate last. Whatever scraps remained after the tribe finished eating, that was their meal. If the hunt had been poor, there might be nothing left at all. They went to sleep hungry and woke before dawn to begin again. Rachel Plummer later described her first months among the Comanche in words stripped of ornament. I was kept constantly at work from earliest dawn until late at night. When I failed to perform my tasks to their satisfaction, I was beaten with clubs and sticks. My life was one of constant dread, suffering, and misery. The beatings came without warning, for working too slowly, for showing exhaustion, for crying when the pain became unbearable, for speaking English to another captive. Sometimes there was no reason anyone could identify at all, simply because they were there, simply because they were powerless, simply because there were no consequences. For Olive Oatman, that first year among the Yavapai pushed her and her little sister to the edge of death. They were worked constantly, fed almost nothing, given no shelter from the brutal sun or freezing desert nights. Mary Ann was only 7 years old. Her body could not withstand the starvation and labor. Olive watched her sister grow thinner each week, weaker each day. She watched the light fade from her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to save her. What broke these women was not just the labor, not just the hunger. It was the understanding that this was not temporary, that rescue was not coming, that the world they had known no longer existed. And that realization, that slow, sinking awareness, was often the most devastating blow of all. What destroyed most captives was not a single act of violence, but time spent hungry, time spent exhausted, time spent realizing that no matter how well you worked, no matter how quietly you suffered, nothing you did could change your position. Once that understanding settled in, many captives simply stopped fighting, not because they chose surrender, but because the human mind can only absorb so much pain before it breaks. Women were worked from before dawn until long after dark. Their bodies became tools. Their worth was measured entirely in output. If they faltered, they were beaten. If they cried, beaten harder. If they tried to speak to another captive in English, beaten again. Language itself became dangerous, because remembering who you had been invited punishment. Rachel Plummer wrote that the fear was constant, not tied to any specific action. I lived, she said, in continual dread. That dread was intentional. Predictable rules allow people to adapt. Random cruelty does not. When punishment comes without warning, the nervous system never rests. Every moment becomes survival. For Olive Oatman, that first year among the Yavapai was a slow erasure. She and her little sister were never allowed to forget that they were expendable. They slept without shelter, exposed to freezing nights and blistering days. They ate whatever scraps no one else wanted. Sometimes there were no scraps at all. Mary Ann began to waste away. Olive described her sister growing lighter in her arms, her body hollowing out, her voice growing weaker. Mary Ann died not in a single moment, but by inches. Olive watched it happen, helpless, knowing that begging, crying, or resisting would only make things worse. Her sister's death marked a turning point. Olive survived, but something in her hardened permanently. Survival required emotional withdrawal. Caring too deeply became dangerous. Rachel Plummer endured similar losses. During her captivity, she gave birth to a child, 6 months after her capture. For a brief time, that infant gave her a reason to endure. She fed him, protected him as best she could. For 6 weeks, she carried him with her as she worked. Then the warriors decided the child was slowing her down. They took my child from me. She later wrote, I never saw him alive again. She was 20 years old. Children were not spared by the logic of captivity. In fact, they were often its most vulnerable victims. Infants slowed work. Crying drew attention. Weakness endangered the group. In a system built entirely around mobility and survival, compassion was treated as a liability, but labor and starvation were only part of the machinery. What truly shattered captives was punishment, especially when it served no functional purpose at all. Matilda Lockhart was 13 years old when she was captured by the Comanche in Texas in 1838. She was a farmer's daughter, a child who had never harmed anyone. She spent 2 years in captivity before being returned during peace negotiations in San Antonio in March of 1840. When Texan authorities saw her, seasoned frontier men who had witnessed violence their entire lives stood in stunned silence. Mary Maverick, who helped bathe and dress the girl, recorded what she saw in her diary. Matilda's head, arms, and face were covered in bruises and sores. Her nose had been burned off to the bone. The flesh was gone entirely. Both nostrils were exposed, denuded of skin. The damage was unmistakable. Matilda explained how it happened. The women of the tribe had made a game of tormenting her. They would wake her from sleep by pressing burning sticks to her face. Her nose was their favorite target, night after night, week after week, month after month. Her screams amused them. The smell of burning flesh made them laugh. Eventually, there was nothing left to burn. Her body was marked everywhere. Arms, back, legs, evidence of cruelty that went far beyond discipline. This was not punishment for disobedience. It was suffering inflicted for its own sake. Mary Maverick wrote that Matilda was utterly degraded and would never hold her head up again. Matilda did not recover. She died 2 years after her release. Her body too damaged to continue. Her spirit too thoroughly broken to want to. Fire was a tool many tribes understood well. Sometimes captives, usually men, were staked to the ground and burned slowly. Fires kept deliberately small, so the suffering lasted for hours. These executions were often meant as messages, warnings to enemies, proof of power. More commonly, fire was used as daily discipline. Heated metal pressed against skin, burning coals placed on arms and legs, sticks pulled directly from campfires and applied to flesh. Pain became routine. The smell of burned skin became familiar. The most horrifying use of fire came as collective punishment. In March of 1840, during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation in San Antonio, Texan authorities killed several Comanche chiefs in the council house fight. The retaliation was swift and merciless. 13 captives were selected. Men, women, children. They were staked to the ground. Fires were built around them. Careful fires. Controlled fires, designed to maximize suffering over time. The process took hours. Among those burned was Matilda Lockhart's younger sister. She was 6 years old. Weeks later, another Comanche band arrived to negotiate for different captives. They brought with them a survivor, someone who described in detail what had happened. Every scream, every hour, the message was unmistakable. Cross us, and everyone you love will suffer. It is difficult to sit with this history. It challenges simple narratives. It forces uncomfortable questions. What would you have done in their place? How long could you have endured? There was another ordeal captives faced, often within days of arrival. It was called running the gauntlet. The captive was forced to run between 2 long rows of warriors armed with clubs, sticks, whips, anything that could cause pain. Every person struck them as they passed. The goal was simple: reach the end still standing. Those who fell were beaten until they rose. Those who could not rise faced worse. The gauntlet served multiple purposes. It was entertainment, a celebration of a successful raid. It was a ritualized breaking of spirit, and it was a test. Those who showed courage, who did not cry out, who kept moving no matter how many times they were struck, sometimes earned marginally better treatment afterward. Those who showed weakness invited more abuse. Rachel Plummer endured the gauntlet multiple times during her captivity. She learned, through pain, that showing suffering only encouraged more violence. Years later, she wrote, "They respected bravery more than anything. I wish I had known it sooner." By the end of her captivity, Rachel learned to fight back. When one of her captors attacked her, she retaliated so fiercely that the warriors nearby laughed and cheered. They admired her refusal to be broken. From that point on, her treatment improved, not dramatically, but enough to notice most captives never reached that point. They grew weaker each day until they died in captivity, or were ransomed back to families who barely recognized them. And some faced a different fate entirely, one that, from a distance, might sound like mercy. They were taken as wives, being taken as a wife was often described, in later retellings, as a softer fate. In certain ways, it was women given to warriors were fed with the family instead of eating scraps. They faced less random physical abuse. They had a defined place within the social order. Someone, in a limited and conditional sense, was responsible for them. But there was no choice. Not ever. Young women were assigned as rewards for successful raids. They were expected to fulfill every duty of a wife: domestic labor, obedience, and sexual submission. Resistance was met with violence until resistance stopped. What looks like acceptance in historical records was often simply the exhaustion of someone who had learned that survival required compliance. Some women adapted, not because they wanted to, but because adaptation was the only alternative to constant suffering. Over time, daily routines replaced shock. Language replaced silence. Familiarity replaced terror. The human mind, remarkably, can normalize almost anything if the alternative is death. Cynthia Ann Parker is the most famous example. She was 9 years old when Comanche warriors attacked Fort Parker on that same May morning in 1836, the same raid that took Rachel Plummer. Cynthia watched her family killed and was carried away into a world she could not comprehend. But unlike Rachel, Cynthia did not spend months or years in captivity. She spent 24 years. She grew up Comanche. She learned their language fluently. She adopted their customs, their beliefs, their way of life. She married a warrior chief named Pita Nocona and had 3 children with him, a daughter she called Prairie Flower, and 2 sons, one of whom would become Quanah Parker, later remembered as the last great chief of the Comanche people. By all surviving accounts, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, loved her children, loved the life she had built. Whatever violence had marked her childhood, adulthood had given her something recognizable as belonging. In December of 1860, Texas Rangers tracked her down. What history calls a rescue was, for Cynthia Ann, another raid. She did not recognize the men who seized her. She screamed for her husband. She fought them. She begged to stay with her family. They took her anyway. Pita Nocona was killed during the confrontation or died shortly afterward from wounds. Accounts differ. Her sons escaped and vanished into the plains. She never saw them again. Only her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, was carried away with her. For Cynthia Ann Parker, the rescue was a second captivity. She spent the remaining 10 years of her life trying to escape back to the Comanche. She was watched constantly by relatives who believed they were protecting her. She refused to adapt to Anglo-American life. She mourned openly. She withdrew. When Prairie Flower died of influenza, some historians believe Cynthia Ann simply stopped eating. She died in 1870, heartbroken, having lost both worlds. What saved her, destroyed her. Not all women were taken as wives. Not all adapted. Many endured years of captivity, only to emerge as shadows of who they had been. Rachel Plummer was eventually ransomed. When her father finally saw her again, he barely recognized his daughter. She was emaciated, covered in scars. Her eyes held something that had not been there before. She wrote her memoir, one of the earliest captivity narratives published in Texas. She became pregnant again and gave birth to a healthy son. 2 months later, she died. Her body simply gave out. Survival had cost more than it had left. Her story did not end there. Rachel's 2-year-old son, James, torn from her arms during the Fort Parker raid, was eventually ransomed and returned to the family in 1842. He was 8 years old. He had spent 6 years among the Comanche, long enough to forget his birth family entirely, long enough to belong to a different world. He had to be taught, slowly and painfully, how to become someone else again. Olive Oatman's survival followed yet another path. After a year of brutal treatment among the Yavapai, she was traded to the Mojave tribe. Her life there was more complex. The Mojave did not treat her as expendable labor. They adopted her, gave her land to farm, tattooed her face with their sacred blue marks, 5 lines across her chin that signified belonging. But adoption did not mean freedom. She could not leave. When Olive finally walked into Fort Yuma in 1856, 5 years after her capture, she weighed barely 80 pounds. She could barely speak English. Words came slowly, painfully, as if translated from another language. The tattoos on her face announced her history to everyone she would ever meet. Olive became famous. Lecture tours, a published book. She was celebrated as a symbol of frontier survival. She married a cattleman and lived quietly for decades. But she never fully returned to who she had been. Her husband reportedly spent years buying and burning copies of her memoir, trying to give her peace from a past that would not release her. Olive kept a jar of Mojave mesquite seeds on her shelf until the day she died, a small, silent reminder of a life she could never completely leave behind. By the 1870s, historians estimate that at least 30% of Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. The line between settler and native was far blurrier than 19th century Americans wanted to believe. Some captives became fully assimilated. They married, bore children, and refused rescue when it finally came. They had become someone else. Others returned physically, but not entirely. They flinched at sudden movements, woke screaming from nightmares decades later, could not explain to their families what had happened because the words simply did not exist, and thousands simply disappeared. No memoirs, no testimonies, no graves, just names in faded ledgers and families who spent the rest of their lives hoping for news that never came. The frontier was not a place of heroes and villains. It was not the romantic adventure dime novels portrayed. It was a landscape of survival, brutal, bloody, and uncompromising, where every side committed acts that would scar generations. History calls these women victims, and they were, every single one of them. But they were also something else. They were survivors. They were witnesses. They were the ones who came back to tell us what happened in places no one else could see, in places the rest of America preferred to forget. Their stories matter. Their suffering matters. Their courage matters, because when we forget them, we forget the truth about who we were and who we are. Perhaps nothing reveals the true brutality of frontier captivity more clearly than what happened to children. For women who survived long enough to bear them, children were both a reason to live and a sentence of inevitable loss. Rachel Plummer learned this twice. Her 2-year-old son, James, was torn from her arms during the Fort Parker raid. She never saw him again during her captivity. He vanished into the Comanche world, absorbed into a life she could not reach. 6 months later, already broken by labor and beatings, Rachel gave birth again. For 6 brief weeks, she cared for that infant as best she could. She fed him when there was food. She hid him when she could. She worked harder than her body could sustain to avoid punishment. Then the warriors decided the baby slowed her down. "They took my child from me." She wrote, "I never saw him alive again." That sentence is all history has. Rachel was eventually ransomed. When her father finally saw her, he barely recognized his own daughter. She was emaciated, scarred, and hollowed out by what she had endured. Yet she tried to live. She wrote her memoir, one of the first captivity narratives published in Texas. She became pregnant again. She gave birth to a healthy son. 2 months later, she died. Her body simply gave out. Survival had taken everything it had to give. Years later, her first son, James, the child torn from her arms, was ransomed and returned to the family. He was 8 years old. He had spent 6 years among the Comanche, long enough to forget his birth family, long enough to belong somewhere else. He had to be taught how to speak English again, how to live again, how to become someone he no longer remembered being. What captivity took could not always be returned. Olive Oatman's return followed a different pattern, but it carried its own cost. When she emerged from the Mojave world into Fort Yuma in 1856, she was barely recognizable. 80 pounds, broken English, and across her chin, 5 blue lines, tattoos marking her as adopted, claimed, and transformed by another people. Those lines followed her for the rest of her life. She became a public figure, lectured across the country. Her story was consumed eagerly by audiences who wanted to be shocked, but not unsettled. She married. She lived quietly, yet the past never loosened its grip. The tattoos could not be removed. The memories could not be explained. Her husband reportedly spent years buying and burning copies of her memoir, trying to shield her from a history that refused to stay buried. Olive kept a jar of Mojave mesquite seeds on her shelf until the day she died, a reminder of a life she had survived, but never fully left. By the late 19th century, historians estimate that at least 30% of Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. Entire bloodlines crossed the frontier divide. The line between settler and native was not a wall. It was a wound, far blurrier, far more complicated than the simple stories of civilization versus savagery that newspapers preferred to tell. Some captives assimilated completely. They learned the language fluently, adopted the customs, married, raise children. When rescue parties finally found them, they refused to leave. They had become someone else, and that someone did not want to go back. Others returned physically, but never truly came home. They startled at sudden sounds, woke screaming from nightmares decades later, could not explain to their families what had happened because the words simply did not exist. Trauma lived in their bodies long after captivity ended, and thousands were never accounted for at all. No memoirs, no court testimonies, no rescue stories, just names in old documents, entries in faded ledgers, and families who spent the rest of their lives waiting for news that never came. The American frontier was not an adventure. It was not a proving ground for heroes. It was a place of survival, brutal, bloody, and unforgiving, where suffering was common and innocence offered no protection. Everyone involved was shaped by it. Everyone carried its consequences forward. History often calls these women victims, and they were unquestionably, but they were also something more. They were survivors. They were witnesses. They were the ones who returned to tell us what happened in places no one else could see, places the rest of America preferred to forget. Their stories matter. Their suffering matters. Their courage matters. Because when we forget them, we forget the truth about our past. And when we forget that truth, we lose the ability to understand who we are. This is not a story of triumph. It is a story of endurance, of lives fractured and carried forward anyway, of scars that never faded, of voices that spoke when silence would have been easier. And that is why these stories must be told.